Welcome to the Album Anniversary Podcast. Today's show is about Curse Your Branches by David Bazan. It was released September 1st, 2009, according to my research, and celebrating a 15-year anniversary. I'm your host, Caleb, or Caleb the Spy, on Twitter and Instagram, and every day on those social media sites I post about what I call album anniversaries. And look, it's just the anniversary of the album's release date. If I don't know that release date, I've just picked a date on my calendar that seems to fit, and it's just an opportunity to celebrate that album. And you know what? That's how this started. A couple of years ago, I had created a calendar to celebrate the release date of some of my favorite albums. In the last year or so, the list of albums has grown significantly, and I now have over 2,000 albums tracked on my calendar. On this show, I often focus on alternative rock and punk and my strange obsession with ska. In the 90s, I was super into the Christian music scene, so those sorts of topics come up all the time on the show. And I've always had this fascination with historically important albums or musical events. Today, I'm joined again by Brock to come back and answer 5 simple, hopefully simple, although now that I've been on the other end, which is a whole other thing we'll talk about, or I might talk about, 5 simple questions about Curse Your Branches by David Bazan, formerly of Pedro the Lion. Brock, welcome back to the show.
Hi there.
So glad to have you back. You're becoming a regular guest, which is what I was hoping for, is that I'd be able to find people who could be those regular guests. So I'm glad you're here. How have you been? I know it's been a busy couple weeks for you.
It sure has. That's my evil plan to save the world, is to become your regular guest. So thank you.
Perfect.
No, been great. I've been doing a lot of running, as I guess anybody who follows me on Instagram knows. And I'm up to how many days in the year? We're approaching 250 days, I think, in the year at this point, where I've done at least a mile every day. And I will not say that it's fun all the time, but I am glad I'm doing it. So yeah. What happens next year, I don't know.
That's awesome. I've been trying to walk more at work because I have a little treadmill underneath my desk. And
oh, those are cool.
Yeah, varying degrees of success, I'll be honest.
Yeah.
But I've been trying. And I know you've been, the last couple of weeks, this is going to come out this soon enough. So this will be fairly current. But in the last couple of weeks, I've seen pictures on Instagram, I think. I don't know if they've been on Twitter, but I know I've seen them on Instagram of you with Aaron Sprinkle and Derek Webb. So some traveling to see shows or
that's right.
Make connections.
Yeah, no, a friend of mine lives on Vashon Island where Aaron Sprinkle lives. And I figured I'd just reach out to him when I was visiting this friend and said, hey, I'm going to be on the island. Do you want to get coffee? And so me and another friend who are super big fans of Aaron Sprinkle, we had coffee with Aaron Sprinkle. He was great. It was really nice of him to come and meet up. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yep. Saw the Derek Webb show. He was doing all the old Caedmon's Call stuff. It's really, really cool set he put together in terms of anybody who listened to or was a fan of. And I, honestly, don't tell anybody. I wasn't even that big of a fan of Caedmon's Call back in the day. And yet I shared a lot of car rides with a friend who was a huge fan. So I know all the stuff.
Sure.
And, it was a great show. And I drove all the way to Idaho to see Smash Mouth. So
wow. I now that you mention it, I remember seeing the pictures of that too. So
yeah. Opening for Sugar Ray at the North Idaho State Fair. It was quite the event.
That sounds about right at this point for both of their careers.
That's a mood.
North Idaho.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. Well, that's awesome. Glad to see you're able to do that. I envy your ability to get away from work and do some of that stuff, or get away at least a little. I am not good at making that time for myself. My wife pushes me to do it, but I'm not always great
good for
about
her.
It. Yeah, she's super encouraging. I'm the problem, just so we're clear. With that out of the way, I say we dive into this album and we'll tackle Curse the Branches by David Bazan.
From the soil, we were beautiful and true, in control of our emotions, till we ate the poison fruit, and now it's hard to be, hard to be, hard to be.
So before we jump in, I know I said we're just going to jump in, but I do want to do a couple disclaimers. One, this is my second Pedro / David Bazan album I've done, And, I've put out I'm working on my third Poro Lou related show of the year. And, I should have done Grace by Jeff Buckley, but that's kind of how this schedule works. My schedule in some ways is kind of dictated by the calendar. The calendar kind of says these are albums you can do shows on. And so it's kind of a bummer. I know some of these albums that are, people are really, really excited about on Twitter or on Instagram. I'm not doing shows on those because I'm trying to focus on albums that are celebrating big albums. And I'm just having to do some picking and choosing. And so trying to find the right mix. So yes, it's probably a little funny that I'm doing my second, David Bazan album. And I skipped Grace by Jeff Buckley because I think a day before there was a chance to do a show with my dad. And so, just kind of something I've noticed.
Great, by the way.
Oh yeah,
I really enjoyed that.
Super fun, and I kept on thinking well, how often do you get to have your 71-year-old? I called him 70-year-old at one point, but he's 71-year-old dad on a podcast. So just kind of a scheduling note, yep, part of this is just dictated by the calendar. I would do a 5 Iron Frenzy album every episode, but that'd get kind of boring, and this kind of helps keep things interesting. So there's a little note on scheduling. The other thing I wanted to say before we dive into this is that, in my opinion, there's no way to tackle this album in particular without dealing with matters of faith and belief. And I do it on my other show, the youth group show that me and my friend Scott put out. We kind of have a disclaimer about just the nature of belief and the nature of what we're going for on that show, and kind of what I'm going for on this show too, is that Brock and I might say things that we actually don't 100% agree with each other, because faith is complicated, belief is complicated. These are not simple issues, and we're talking about it in the context of an album. So I want this space to be a space where somebody can just say what they want and what they believe or what is on their mind, and there's not going to be an argument. So that's what we're doing. So just because Brock says something or just because I say something, I would not make the assumption that we both believe that exact same thing, but I'm not going to fight about it. We're not going to argue about those things. I want people to come on the show and express why they love albums. So I kind of want to just get that disclaimer out there, because there's no way to, in my opinion, like I said, to engage with this album, which is curse your branches. I think I said curse the branches earlier. I'm very, very smart, but just no way to do it without talking about those things. And we're not going to argue about them. We're not going to, we're just not here to do that. So another disclaimer I wanted to throw out there.
Sounds good. Thank you. Appreciate it. That's what Twitter is for, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's where the
arguments happen. Yeah.
You and I are going to do it there. We're going to duke it out. Bro.
Yeah.
All right. So back to the album here then. Again, released September 1st, 2009. I feel pretty confident about that, but I'm not 100%. I'm kind of giving the disclaimer on all albums that I think that's the date. I found it in a couple places. So September 1st, 2009, a 15-year anniversary. Couple things to note about this one is it was 5 years after, at the time, the final Pedro the Lion album, but obviously he's come back and done other albums. So this had been a bit of a break for him. He had been doing some other things, and then 5 years off, he comes back to this album.
He had been experimenting with some solo material. I feel like he'd had like an EP or something before this, so people had gotten used to Bazan without the Pedro moniker. But then Pedro the Lion has always been David Bazan. So
yes,
it seems like, it was more of a name change than anything else.
Yes. And he will, I think, openly admit at this point that he shouldn't have done this, that he should have just kept it under Pedro the Lion, because he's like, I think he has commented in somewhere about having this split discography is just not ideal for sales and whatnot.
Right. And he has returned to the Pedro moniker, and it's not the Pedro the Lion that we knew in the late 90s or the mid aughts, but it's, he's back to that.
And it's been great, in my opinion.
Yeah. And with no appreciable difference, I would say, in either the subject material or how he approaches it, or necessarily the sound. Like, he's evolved, but it's definitely, he's always been doing what he always does.
Yeah. In fact, we'll get to it, how important that those new set albums actually is. And we'll get there when we talk about introduction to the album. So this was technically David's first album. He released under his own name. We just talked about that. David produced this album and recorded the entire thing in his basement studio, with the majority of the instrumentation being done by him. There's a couple other people who contributed, but he did the vast majority of the instrumentation.
Yeah. One to note is just that on the very last track on the record, his dad plays piano. Which is a really cool thing. And not only because it's the family connection, that's cool enough, but also I think the stark difference between Bazan's conclusions and his father's conclusions as a Assemblies of God pastor,
Yeah.
it was a big olive branch from his dad in a lot of ways. I think
Hmm.
to appear on the record and participate in it. So that's always been a really neat thing, I think, in my mind.
Yeah, that's awesome. See, this is why you should be on every show. You're going to bring stuff that I don't know.
Don't ask me any questions about Kiss or Poison. I'm out of info.
If I cover a Kiss or Poison album, I'll say it. I'll say it right here. If I cover a Kiss or Poison album, you'll know I've been doing this for about 20 years, and I'm really scraping the bottom of the barrel. I don't
Free
think I
Jamba
have,
Juice for everybody at that point.
yeah, I don't even think I have any of those albums on the calendar. So that's awesome. All right, the album debuted #1 on the Billboard Heat Seekers. I don't know how that works, but it gets commented a lot on. So there you go, #1 on the Billboard Heat Seekers and 116 on the Billboard 200. Pretty solid for, I think, a pretty independent release to be up there at 116. So that's a solid return on investment. And it was released to very, very solid reviews. And the last thing here, a number of people in reviews I went back and looked at, they reference, and I'm sure we'll get into this, that this is basically people kept on calling it a breakup album with God. So again, there's going to be commentary about faith and belief on this album.
Very much so. Yeah. I think it was on Barsuk or Barsuk. I'm not sure how you say that, but label mates with Death Cab for Cutie.
Okay.
So a notable Seattle-based record company, I think.
And he's now with the same one that, oh man, Jeff Rosenstock's on that record label, and Alves. I can't say the Marry Me Archie band. I can't say their name.
Well, now I can't tell, but either way you cut it, you should get some distance if you plan to take a stand. God bless the house divided. God bless the weeds in the weed. God bless the lamb lit under.
All right, so we'll jump into our first question. How did you discover this album?
Well, I think I had been friends with an influential friend of mine who got me into bicycles, got me into kind of anti-consumerist, and was it Adbusters? You remember that magazine about basically not being a consumer and not enabling advertisers. So super underground. He repaired his own clothes and this sort of thing. And he was the only liberal, I think, on a Bible college campus full of conservatives.
Okay.
So he was the first person that introduced me to Pedro the Lion. And I think at this point, he and I had not been in close touch, but I had picked up Pedro records. And when I had heard that, oh, yeah, Bazan has a new record coming out, I felt like I had to hear it. So you're not hearing me say that I downloaded it from a file sharing service. That would be wrong. But you can imagine how easy it was for that to happen at that time.
Okay. I didn't hear that. So
yeah.
David won't either.
Yep. Well, and now I own the vinyl. So I think that perhaps atones for any sort of, maybe not.
So you had already been into Pedro, and this, when it kind of came out, you were kind of on top of it pretty much from the get-go.
For sure. And my first Pedro record was the Hard to Find a Friend, which had some really interesting songs about how you handle faith and belief and how you handle just kind of what happens in church versus what you read in the scriptures and that sort of thing. And then Control, which is a beautifully sad and despondent record.
Yeah.
But I remember being very into both of those. Yeah. And so when I heard, that there was a new record from Bazan coming out, it seemed like it would be important to check that out and see what he was up to. And I think it was preceded by a bit of hubbub, just based on the content and based on kind of where he was, because he'd always been on the edges. He was a kind of a figure in Christian music that was, very close to the edges.
Yeah.
There are some interesting stories about him at Cornerstone and how much liquor he would consume before performing there, and making waves not just in that behavior, but also in kind of what he was covering, the language he chose to use in some of his records. It would definitely was already stirring the pot or poking the bear or something like that. And so this promised, I think, based on everything people were saying about it, the reviews and such, this promised to do more of that. And so I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. And the joke I would make is you made deconstruction cool before it became cool. Hi, I'm going to break in here before I embarrass myself on my own show. I'm going to reference the individual who joined me to talk about Pedro the Lion's Achilles Heel, that album. It was Adrian. I forgot his name. I knew it, but I didn't want to say it wrong, so I didn't say it at all. I'm very embarrassed. Adrian joined me on episode 34 to talk about Achilles Heel by Pedro the Lion. It's a great episode. Adrian brought a ton of great insights. Go check out that episode. Okay, back to me embarrassing myself. The first Pedro album we covered on this podcast, the guy who had guested, and I forgot his name, and I'm so sorry. I apologize to no end about not having it up in front of me. He made that comment that was really interesting. He was like, when deconstruction kind of became a thing really in the last 10 years, and a lot of people were going through it, he was like, I had already walked through that with Bazan in the early 2000s, and he had asked a lot of really good questions that I was happy I had answered. And him and Bazan came out in different ways, but he just was like, yeah, it was really good for young me to have that challenge and to be pushed that way. So it was one of the most interesting comments I had heard. So that was a cool way of looking at it, in my opinion. So
for sure. And I mean, the internet was still a bit younger than it is now. And there was less, there were places to dialogue online, but there was far less of it happening. And it was far less normal, I think, to be a message board kid. And so, yeah, if you were going through any sort of change in faith or belief, you didn't have a lot of people to talk about it with. You didn't have friends, be it in person or online, that were supporting that and giving it a name and kind of having, shared themes and memes and that sort of thing, like there is now. And so, very much someone asking the questions. And at this point, I had exited traditional church, and I had been looking at that point, to join an intentional community. I was looking for something, I had read Shane Claiborne, had read a bunch of the other new monastic or Mennonite influenced people, and I was trying to figure out, like, what does this look like here? So I'd already been disillusioned with kind of like traditional evangelical church on a Sunday morning, but I really wanted to do something with that. So as I was hearing the record for the first time, I was sitting in the basement of a shared house that my wife and I got married, and we shared it with two guys who lived upstairs. We had the basement. This was my first exposure to the new record, as I was kind of in that shift myself, trying to make sense of what this new paradigm was.
Interesting. So for me, my exposure to this album kind of goes back to really how important the new version of Pedro the Lion is. Because I had heard of Pedro the Lion. I had probably even heard some of the records. And I say this about a lot of things. I was not ready for Pedro the Lion in 2004. And I was definitely not listening to this in 2009. I just wasn't. I was just not there. And so I missed all of early Pedro. And it was 2019 that when he released Phoenix, I want to say. And 2019, that album that he put out, so that's like 5 years ago now, the song Quietest Friend off that album was my favorite song of the year. And I was kind of blown away by that album. And so it's only been 5 years since I took the deep dive back into all things Pedro and David Bazan. And he's climbed up the ladder of, album, artists that I'm really, really love and really, really can mean something, even though, again, it's only been a 5-year thing. And I know there's probably people who have much stronger attachments and obsessions, but I'm really thankful for that turn back to Pedro the Lion, because it kind of got me looking at it again, and that album blew me away. I thought it was just fantastic. One of my favorites 2019. Again, Quietest Friend, my favorite song by him and my favorite song of that year. And I think it was 2019. But that's when I kind of took that deep dive into Pedro, and that's probably the first time I gave this album a deep listen was starting sometime in 2019. So I spent a lot of time with him in 2019.
Right before the unpleasantness.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Then I got into ska all over again.
In terms of the having all the catalog to review, it's kind of like what people say about like television and streaming and whatnot, is that now you can sit down and you can binge a show. You can watch, for 3 days straight if you want to catch up on these shows that you used to have to wait for. So you have the advantage of the, I guess it's musical streaming, except as I remember, you don't do that, right?
I don't. I think I ended up ordering all of his stuff from the library and checking it all out from the library, and I had most of it. I think I had to stream a couple things here and there, but the disadvantage of doing that, this is a total tangent, Jeepers. We're not even through one question. I am the worst
I'm
host
okay
ever.
with it. Yeah.
The disadvantage with that as like a go back and look is sometimes it can be really overwhelming. Like if you
Yeah.
don't have a good guide through it, because he's got a ton of material, and if you start in the wrong spot,
Hmm.
you know, you can do it. I think that's why when some people are like, oh, you got to go check this artist out. If they don't give you that right spot and you find it, because I had kind of found him in 2019, like I already knew I really wanted to do that deep dive. So it made it a lot easier because there's stuff that he's put out that it's like, yep, this is fine. It's not blow me away, but it's good and it's got a build. And so there can be a disadvantage to that go back and look. Like, you know, you can't do it with like Dylan. You have 30, 40 albums. You got to have a focus
daunting.
point. You're
Yep.
just going to get lost.
Yeah.
So,
She was out late drinking, killed a mother of 3. She said, please, daddy, please. She said, please, daddy, please. She said, please, daddy, please. She said, please, daddy, please.
let's jump into the next one because I'm a good host and I'm kind of keeping us moving along. What do you love about this album?
I got to say, the Pedro records were always great. And one of the great things about the Pedro records is that even from the beginning, I want to say that Bazan performed most of the tracks. The EP that came out on Tooth and Nail, it's got a bunch of guys in the picture, but I forget. And I want to say that most of what I've heard, most of the instruments that you'll hear on the tracks, I think were recorded by Bazan. He's always been a multi-instrumentalist.
Yeah.
And so this record brings in a couple featured players, but the majority of it is played kind of like he plays all of the, you know, the rhythm section, the drums, the bass, the guitar, and some of the keys. I know this was produced by T.W. Walsh, who had a pretty big presence on his Achilles Heel album.
Yeah.
And so that's also worth noting. I think that, you know, he and Walsh have collaborated several times, including the Headphones project, which I think predates this, but also postdates the other Pedro the Lion material.
Yep.
Which was an all synth band sort of thing. But yeah, the sound on this just draws me in from the very beginning. Like it's so rich, so lush, and so deep. You know, I think in maybe opposition to some of the Pedro stuff where it's pretty minimal, still creating, you know, I think the records previous in the Pedro catalog were created to have a resonance and to fill the space, you know, but kind of starkly with fewer instruments. This has a lot more layers. It's a lot more intricate.
Yeah.
And maybe that's at least partially allegorical to the content as well. There's a lot going on here from the surface level all the way down. So
I don't know if it was this album where he really started to play with that piano and synth, and I know it'd been on some of the other ones, but you notice it like right out the get-go. Like Hard to Be, it actually, that's the opening track. It kind of almost grabs you how well he has got them working together. That piano, because it feels like there's a piano, that feels like there's a synth, and it also feels like the bass is working really well with those. He kind of has all three of them going, I think. Again, I'm no musician. I say it every show, but that's how it feels. And I just think it works so well. And that just continues from that point on. The rest of the album just musically is so smooth. And I like that that phrase, deep and rich. That's a great way of looking at it and how it feels.
It's also interesting to me that this record, lyrically, it goes in a lot of different directions than a lot of his other stuff. And I think that maybe even if he's not happy with it, I think that supports the change from the band name to his own name as a solo artist, just the lyrical style. Because a lot of the Pedro lyrics were either storytelling or first person narrative or something along those lines. And this has to do a lot with a lot more esoteric material. You know, there's a lot more ideas being tossed around, which it's not that he didn't do that before, but he did it in the structure of storytelling or in the structure of narration or something along those lines. So that's a big change here. And I think it's, frankly, I welcome it. I think it's a great thing.
Yeah.
And his newest stuff is kind of returned to that very autobiographical storytelling of his own life and his own experiences with not too much layer of metaphor or anything like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is definitely it's a shift in that way as well.
I like the music on this, but the lyrical content is, I think, pretty amazing on this album. Even for somebody who still goes to church and still, you know, believes in Christianity, I still am blown away by just some of the way he presents it. so well some of these just, I think, valid questions and concerns that are good to think through. And I have a number of lyrics that I kind of think through, but for me, the highlight of this album, just to kind of, I don't know, to show how well he pulls this off, is it's from Bearing Witness, and it's though it may alienate your family and blur the lines of your identity, let go of what you know and honor what exists. Son, that's what bearing witness is. Daughter, that's what bearing witness is. That is such a genuine comment and thing to throw out there. I think it is just, it's so beautifully done. It doesn't feel like he's talking down to anybody or being overly cynical. Maybe he is, but it just feels like an honest expression, and it's just hard not to connect with that one in particular. There's a ton of other ones, but that's the one that jumps out to me every listen, is just how authentic and real that feels, and how well he presents that.
Yeah, and I think the kind of the flipping in some ways of like a common phrase, right? That at least in certain circles, bearing witness is going to be a thing that people say all the time. They might not even know what it means anymore because it's so repeated.
Yeah.
The meaning is somewhat divorced from the use, or it's just not thought about. But the way those lyrics are written in that song, it almost like he talks about the idea that, that he can't bear witness to things he hasn't experienced, and that he can't stop talking about the things he has experienced.
Yeah.
But like it's almost written in such a way that like you can almost apply the poetry in either direction in some ways. Not saying that's how he wrote it, but that's necessarily like kind of what I see. I think the lyrics can point in. It's interesting to look at one set of beliefs through the rubric of those lyrics, and then look at another set.
Yeah.
And it's kind of instructive in both ways.
Yeah.
Which I guess is what good poetry really does.
Yeah.
That's what bearing witness is.
Yeah. There's just so many good moments too. Like, I think it's one of the early on, it's, all this misbehaving grew from one enchanted tree. Feels a little playful, but yet serious. Like he walks a line, in my opinion, really, really well. And now, granted, I'm a person who's also really, really open to the idea of like, these are good questions. I'm sure some people wouldn't be, but like, he just seems to walk that line so well on this, where he's asking these legitimate questions, making these legitimate, things that he's throwing out there, but it doesn't feel overly cynical, but feels just like, this is authentically who I am, which now I've said like 3 times. Good commentary by me.
Repetition, I think, is what it takes sometimes to drive the point home.
This is what having 4 kids does to you. You just gotta keep on going.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, it's also interesting to me, like alcohol plays a pretty prominent place in a lot of the lyrics here.
Yeah.
It's a theme in a lot of the songs, and he's had his own struggles. I forget, because I think at this point he would say he is now sober. At least he doesn't drink anymore. And I don't know when he made that change.
Yeah.
But I know that he did have some pretty, like I mentioned earlier, some pretty notable incidents, and it was kind of a characteristic, right? And he went from being maybe, if not the life of the party, at least he knew how to party. At some point, it was a defense mechanism. It was a way to avoid some of these things that later he, I think, was willing to confront more solidly, more squarely. But it's interesting, just like, in my experience, I have turned to alcohol at times when I've been overwhelmed with my own crisis of faith or my own beliefs. I think in the years following this record, not necessarily as a result of this, but I remember trying to find my way in this intentional community, not being able to figure out exactly why we were all together. It was a situation, without getting into the details, it was a situation where I think different people wanted different things.
Yeah.
And I wasn't necessarily as much a realist as an idealist. And so when I couldn't reconcile those things, and I couldn't figure out, exactly why I was here, not to mention being surrounded by a bunch of bearded theologians who like to drink beer, it was easy to use that as a way to escape some of the mental pain for a while, some of the soul ache. And so I would not recommend that. I don't think that's a good way to go, but I think a lot of people have been there. And I think reckoning with that in these lyrics is really helpful, either, for any of us who have been there and have seen it, or anybody for whom that might be a danger or something that they don't want to get into. I think it's at very least helpfully instructive to review kind of what he presents, because he doesn't present all of that in the best light in these lyrics either. But it's definitely a theme, and it runs through it all.
Yep. I was kind of shocked actually by how much it comes up as I was kind of reading. I was rereading the lyrics leading up to us recording. I was like, wow, it really is. I kind of hadn't even realized how much of a theme he goes into it, because yeah, it comes up on. I can think of at least 2 songs. I think even 3 of the 11 make reference to it. So yeah.
Yeah, in Bless This Mess, he's got the dream about trying to warn his family about hell, and then they burn, and then he awakes and he's thirsty.
Yeah,
a wicked thirst is the lyric, and yeah, I mean it's an interesting way to process all of this stuff, and it's it's part of people's experience.
Yep.
Again, not saying you shouldn't drink, not saying you should. It's something that everybody has to make their own decisions about. But just watching again, if there is some storytelling in here, if it's in some of this, Bazan uses that, I think, to good effect.
Yeah, every time he doesn't seem to miss when it comes to doing that. So
I think in some ways, people have come to and lost faith over the course of history. It's nothing new, and I think that maybe. I don't know, maybe the mistake in the landscape between evangelicalism and everybody who either has been or is no longer. It's easy to assume that there are either selfish motives involved here or something else. But this is, kind of like the musical text of modern deconstruction in a way. And this was a helpful thing, I think, to some. Like I said, I didn't have necessarily words for what I was feeling or what I was thinking. Didn't even necessarily have permission to think these things until someone else kind of led me through it.
Yeah.
And we referenced before I went to see the Derek Webb show here in Oregon when he was coming through. Webb has a similar progression, but at different times and maybe focused on some different things. But between Bazan and Derek Webb, I think those were 2 really strong voices in my life that at least gave me some space to help sketch out my own thoughts on how I saw the world and my experience in it.
It's a powerful moment when I've had that with, of course, again, because I got to reference them every episode, but with Five Iron Frenzy so many times and so many other bands. But
yeah,
there's been so many times where I've thought stuff or kind of been feeling a certain way, and then there'll be a Five Iron song that I'm like, oh, there it is. I couldn't have articulated it that way, and there it is right in front of me. So.
All fallen leaves should curse their branches for not letting them decide where they should fall.
Kind of started getting into it a little bit, but why is this album important to you, or why do you think it still holds up? If it's not important to you, but I think it is, so I'll just leave it at that. Why is this album still important to you?
I think, again, just the idea of there are certain places that you're almost not allowed to go, at least as I was raised. And I went to a Bible college, and so I spent a lot of time studying theology. I think one of my biggest disappointments in my freshman year at Bible college was that I was presented with various perspectives around theology as opposed to the correct. And I'm grateful for that, because I think it's obvious to anyone who has studied theology that there are a lot of questions that may or may not have answers, or it may not be possible to arrive at solid conclusions, and that you do have to accept something more or less on faith. There are a lot of things that I didn't feel like I had permission to think. I was told that you have to come up with something. You have to figure out which perspective. Are you a Calvinist? Are you Arminian in your theology about certain things? Do you believe in this? The lyric here in Curse Your Branches, red and orange or red and yellow? In which of these do you believe? I need your signature before you leave. And it's funny because going to Bible college, they asked us to sign a statement of faith before they would give us our diploma. They're not listening. So I can tell you that I signed the statement of faith. One of our professors said that, you could sign it and make an amendment if there's something that is in the theological statement for this Bible college that you don't necessarily agree with. You could make an amendment and sign it with a clear conscience or something along those lines. I did not take that much time at this point. I did some mental math on who was going to come back and ask me about that. And it seemed clear that the answer was no one. And so I signed the statement and I walked in my mortar and I got my diploma. But yeah, the idea that you have to choose something, you have to come down on something, you have to be certain about a lot of things. I think just just a whole album's worth of someone being uncertain,
Mm.
and sharing that in the art the way Bazan did, to me was immensely valuable.
Yeah.
A friend of mine, I think I remember mentioning it to this friend, and they, I think, were either in the pastorate or something close at the time. And I remember mentioning it to them and saying, have you heard this? What do you think about this?
Mm.
And the friend said, I think it asks some dangerous questions.
Mm.
And that was an interesting phrase to me because I was trying to figure out how questions themselves can be dangerous. I suppose there are questions in poor taste, if you ask them in the wrong place or in the wrong way. But when you're trying to figure out something and you're genuinely trying to find an answer that serves you and explains what you see in the world, to me it seemed like we need poets to help us ask these questions.
Mm.
And I think certainly there are things that can be known, there are things that can't be known, there is right, there is wrong, and everyone has a standard for that.
Mm.
But you can't rule out the question. I think someone shared with me at some point, and I forget if this was a Bible college professor or if it was somebody else, but the idea that the truth doesn't necessarily need to be defended. That if someone wants to disagree, they're free to follow that line of thought, line of reasoning, and if they're wrong, they'll find out eventually.
Mm.
Similar to that, I always came to the conclusion later in my Christian life that it wasn't up to me to change people's minds. It wasn't up to me to convict them of something, to present a compelling argument.
Yeah.
The commands of Jesus were always to love, and the Holy Spirit, I think, was to be. I called the Holy Spirit the closer. That the Holy Spirit gets the coffee. So, in my experience in working with this as something, I think that kind of helped me through some of those times, it was essential to have someone else's experience, not to give me answers, because I don't think a lot of the lyrics in this record offer answers. They just say, this is what it's like, this is how it's been, and this is what's on my mind.
Yeah.
And again, in a time when fewer people were talking about this, and I was still trying to figure out where I landed with a lot of this stuff, this was immensely helpful to me. So that's definitely a big piece of my experience.
Yeah. And I think that's why this holds up. Even if it's not an important record to you personally, this holds up because of that. I think you are not the only person who would be able to articulate so eloquently why this is an important album to them. And I think that is why it holds up. That's why it holds up, and that's why it has a strength. Even if you come to a different conclusion, I think so many people can relate to what he is talking about, and it can be that kind of balance to bounce ideas off of, almost to hear somebody engage with them, that you can have that conversation with the album. I think that is beautifully stated, and I think that's my answer to why it holds up, because there's so many people out there who can engage with this the way you just described. So yeah, I think that's beautiful.
Thanks, Caleb. The idea too of eternal torment being a threatening punishment, that's also woven through many of the songs.
Yeah.
And it is interesting because I think I'm trying to remember when Rob Bell's Love Wins came out. I want to say that was within a couple years of this record.
Yeah.
And, Bell obviously got unceremoniously dethroned by the evangelical majority. And he was told that his questions weren't valid. They had no problem with C.S. Lewis asking similar questions, but if you're modern, then you can't. And so that was definitely a thing that was on my mind and on our minds at the time as well.
Yeah.
Of exactly what's at play here, because the evangelical construction of what hell could be versus kind of what it seems to be in the Bible, and kind of what that looks like. Again, I'm not going to tell anybody what to think or not to think, but the idea that that's used as a threat and that the point is intimidation or coercion as opposed to love, that's something that Bazan, I think, certainly tackles several times in this record. And that was I'm kind of censoring myself as well, because I don't want to tell you or your audience what to think either. But just the idea that that somebody had the ability to wrestle with that, grapple with it, and think it through, and maybe come up with either the way this is presented is absurd, or this isn't the point. At the very least, to say that this this doesn't follow the story or the character of Jesus the way I know it.
Yeah, and that's why we did the disclaimer at the beginning, because I know you well enough at this point to know you're not telling people this is the only way to look at this. This is you explaining your experience with it, and it's great. Rob Bell's Love Wins came out in 2011,
okay,
so definitely right in this
after.
right in this space though of this area where I think these questions in a modern setting started to get talked about, and I think that is absolutely part of that time is kind of kicking that off. So I'm glad you're saying what you're saying. Yeah. And I think it's a question we've tackled on the youth group podcast. Why in 90s youth group were we taught so much to fear? It's an episode coming out soonish, hopefully, if I can get the editing done.
Yeah.
Why were we taught to fear hell so much instead of taught to have this amazing relationship with Jesus? They were both taught, but one seemed to have a lot more weight than the other. And that's an experience that I think a lot of 90s youth group kids can relate to. And that's a valid question to ask as well. And you may say, I think people might come out of it because hell's the scariest thing. And we want to make sure people avoid it at all costs. I think that's an answer that people can go with, but I think it's a valid question to why is that the side that we want to fall on, instead of talking about how you can have this amazing relationship with Christ that will bring that joy and bring that fulfillment. Why is that kind of secondary to that first teaching? It's valid things to think through, I think. So.
The table when you chose the scale. Did you write a riddle that you knew they would fail? Did you make them tremble so they would tell the tale? Did you push us when we...
So we've talked about some tracks, but if there's tracks that are to be called out, what are some of your favorite tracks? And I know we've talked about a bunch of them already, but what are some of your favorite tracks that people need to check out from this album?
I think the opener, Hard to Be, and then the second track, Bless This Mess. There's a lot of good. I could go on and probably recommend each and every song on the record, but I think those first
it's always
two,
the challenge.
It really is. Yeah, those first two, I think, give you a pretty good, maybe that's helpful to those who are either on the fence about whether they want to hear this record or whether they like this record or not.
Yep.
If you don't like the first two, you won't like the rest of them. But I think the Hard to Be, kind of grappling with the creation myth and figuring out what it means and whether it does mean what we think it means. The questions of original sin and why we're in the mess we're in. And at the end of that, honestly, is if you need to reorganize this comment back into a different section, feel free. But the metaphor of swinging the tassel, the idea that deciding that this doesn't mean what I was told it means or isn't exactly what I was told it was, and him framing that as, well, I'm graduating, and the idea that that is, I hesitate. I always try to be careful when I say this because I don't want it to come off like I'm somehow better than someone who still believes in evangelical Christianity, because it's not a superiority thing. I'm not saying I'm better or I'm more advanced or progressed or whatever.
Yeah.
But the idea that, I can't go back to where I was. I can't put the it's like Pandora's box, or it's like the genie in the bottle or something. I can't take me having arrived at the conclusions that I've arrived at and stuff it back into the container it used to be in.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really fascinating metaphor. And so really that could be why that song lands so hard for me. I think just that it's a really apt metaphor. It's a really good description of kind of what it's like to develop personally and to change one's beliefs. So yeah.
6.5 minutes, and every moment of it is engaging. It's a great song. It's a great opener. It's not your usual opener, but it's a perfect opener for this album.
Yeah.
I know it's you mentioned the first two. The lyrical content for Please Baby Please is less engaging to me. It's this story of this daughter, I think it's a made up story, but it's this daughter who's got a drinking problem. Musically though, I love that song, and I can vibe with it the whole time. So it's even within that, he has these deep moments, and that's still a deep song. I mean, the end of it is dark, very, very dark, talking about this girl getting drunk and driving and killing a single mother. I mean, it's a dark, dark song, but when you listen to it, it's fairly chipper. It's again him playing with these balances, and musically, I think it's a great little song. It's as close to a pop song as David Bazan's gonna write in some ways, but then the topic's so dark that it'd never make it. So yeah, it's even that. I mean, I think the first 4 songs of this album are pristine and just are a beautiful flow through the first half of the album.
Yeah, with Please Baby Please, that might be the most traditional Pedro style song that he's got on the record, in that it kind of feels like that.
Yeah.
And more of a story, more of a narrative, I think. Yeah.
Yep.
Another thing to note is that Jay Tillman is credited as one of the backing vocalists on Please Baby Please. And that's the person who is better known as Father John Misty.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's cool.
He's been all over a bunch of records, especially from Seattle, but yeah.
Yeah. I think, where I said Bearing Witness earlier, that's got the most poignant lyric for me from the whole album. I think that is my favorite song from this album. It's either that or Hard to Be are probably my 2 favorite. And then I think, I always talk about the closers. I'm a big closer guy. I think In Stitches is a really, really great closer. It's got some wonderful lyrics to close out the album, in my opinion. And now knowing that his father's playing on it, it makes it even more touching. So I think it's a great closer. It's not some bombastic, amazing ending, but it gets done, and it makes you want to flip the record back over. Because I have this one on vinyl. It makes me want to flip the record back over and play the whole thing again. So that's a good way to close an album, in my opinion.
Yeah, very much so.
No, it may alienate your family and blur the lines of your identity. Let go of what you know and honor what exists. Son, that's what bearing witness is. Daughter, that's what bearing witness.
Come to the end. I know we've covered a lot of this, so some of this gets a little retread at the end, but if somebody hasn't checked this album out, what's a reason to go back and check this album out and give it a listen 15 years later?
I think at this point, regardless of where you stand, whether you're a person of faith or you're a person without faith, or a person who's unsure and agnostic like I am, I think the fact that it's written down, this is a document. It's very much almost a cross section of someone in that position, and almost someone who hasn't made a choice, someone who is still in the middle of trying to figure out where they go with all of this. And so, yeah, I think it's a good document of that, and it's definitely worth a listen if you haven't heard it, whichever side of that you end up being on.
The tagline that I saw all over this was, it's his breakup album with God. I think it's a great tagline to go into, even if you don't end up breaking up with God at the end of it, but it's just such an earnest evaluation of faith and belief and some of the things that he went through. It's such an earnest and honest questioning of those things. He does a great job examining those things, in my opinion, honestly examining them. I think the album is worth an examination in and of itself. It's worth a listen to be a part of that examination, wherever you may fall on the sides of faith.
Yeah, and I think it's been often speculated, amongst those who are preaching sermons on Sunday mornings, that maybe those who have left the faith have done so because they really want to. They really want the forbidden fruits. They want to sin. They want to go out and have sex. They want to go out and drink drugs and as one does, drink drugs.
Drink drugs.
I think the way it's positioned, the way it's painted, is not always true to the experiences of the people who are there.
Yeah.
I got to say, I haven't talked to everybody, but so many of the people I've talked to about how they were once religious and no longer are, it's not because they didn't want to be.
Yeah.
There's an honesty to trying to figure things out. There's an honesty to following a theological system to its logical conclusions, and deciding either that works or it doesn't seem like it works. And I think this is a really honest portrayal of that. That people aren't out because necessarily for selfish reasons. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But I think in many cases, people disengage and people extricate themselves from religious systems either because they're not seeing it playing out the way it's supposed to work, and so maybe they think it isn't possible, or again they've just got these things that can't resolve, they can't make sense of, and it's not for lack of trying. I think this album shows some of the depth of that consideration, so I think that's another thing that's maybe of value in terms of how to approach it, how to listen to it.
And like you said, there are people who they can't go back. I think that's a great way of putting it. They just can't go back to what they used to believe. And I think that can work both ways. There are people who have faith and that faith shifts and they can't go back to what they had. And there's people who lose faith. And I know that probably is not a great way of portraying it. The idea of lose faith. You didn't lose it, but the people who don't believe anymore and who can't go back. And I think both of those are powerful experiences. And this gets tricky because obviously as somebody who still has faith, do I want people to engage with the Christian faith? It's brought me hope and joy, and I want that for everybody. But I also, would you want somebody to disingenuously go back? I wouldn't at all. I wouldn't want somebody to just go. I had a conversation with my 16-year-old recently about going through the motions and what that means and why we don't want to do that. I never want my kids to do that, even if it means that we end up believing different things. Don't go through the motions. Be honest about where you're at. And I don't think we want anybody to just go back to where they were because it's easier or it feels like it'd be better. No. We can't go back. And that's true of people who continue on in a different line, continue on where they're at, or leave entirely. And I think that's what we want out of people. That's what we want out of faith and belief, is to be honest with ourselves and not go back just to go through the motions.
Yeah, the fruit of the spirit. I think you remember the Chronicles of Narnia. Yeah. I want to say it was Prince Caspian, in which Susan is told that she can no longer come back to Narnia.
Yeah.
If my memory is off on this, I'll apologize. We can be fact checked later. But I want to say it's that Susan is old enough. She's getting too old for Narnia. She's getting too old for childish stories. That sort of thing. She's having this conversation with Aslan the lion, who's the kind of the Christ and God figure metaphor in there, and he makes his statement to her about what is it? You have known me a little bit here, so that you may know me better elsewhere. And I feel like that's kind of maybe a good perspective for a lot of folks, that maybe Jesus isn't on the other side. We can't go back and find him there, but we may find him elsewhere.
Yeah,
based on how we've known him before.
Yeah.
Good old C.S. Lewis. He's got the metaphors that work.
Despite the fact that his friend Tolkien hated them all.
It was like being beaten over the head with allegory. I think that's how Tolkien described it.
I think so. That's a wonderful friendship. Who would have killed to just sit in on those
to be an Inkling, yeah.
Gosh, that'd be primetime television, better than any reality TV you'll ever watch, man. In my opinion. Oh, man.
Yep.
When Job asked you the question, you responded, "Who are you to challenge your creator?" Well, if that one part is true, it makes you sound defensive, like you had not thought it through enough to have an answer, or you might have bit off more than you could chew.
Okay, well, that's our breakdown of Curse Your Branches. I think I said it right. Good job, me. By David Bazan, formerly of Pedro the Lion. Again, by my best knowledge, released September 1st, 2009. So a 15-year anniversary. Brock, I know you've told people where people can find you online the last couple times, but one more time, where are the places to find you? I know Instagram and Twitter for sure are good places to find you online.
Well, you can go to at Caleb the Spy on Twitter, subsequently known as X, and you'll see some of my tweets retweeted there.
Yes.
But yeah, I'm there. I'm on Instagram as well at Brockman, BROCKMON, and you'll see me running every day, at least for the rest of the year. And it's where I post a lot of my album anniversary stuff as well. So.
Yep.
So much music to be had. And if you're familiar with it, there's the on Facebook, the 90s CCM recovery group. And that's a great group of people, a lot of whom I think are probably in a similar position to me, and a lot of whom are not and are still very charitable and generous. And one of the things I love about that group is that it's run so it's not full of jerks. What's the best word for it? Yeah.
I agree.
I appreciate what they've done there. So that's where you'll find me online mostly.
And
sorry, just if anybody's familiar with the Pickle and Boot Shop, which features Joe Yerke and Reese Roper of two prominent Christian ska bands, I am now part of a recap and further discussion show spun off of that show. So it's a very niche market, but we call ourselves the Squids. Stay for the Squids. We've got a recap show where we go back and talk about stuff. So some cool guys. I'm just getting to know them and getting back into speaking on mic. So it's been fun to do that.
Yeah. Pickle Home Companion, right?
That's Pickle Home Companion. You can find it wherever podcasts are delivered.
There you go. That's exactly what I was going to bring up. I was going to say, I've heard a rumor, or I may have listened to it, that you're doing a show. So yeah, I'm glad you got to plug that.
That's it.
That is it's funny the different communities that you can get into, because you can talk about the 90s, the 90s recovery group. I think that's a solid group to be in, and it's so distinct from the Pickle and Boot Shop. That's got a different feel, just a little different conversation, where it kind of is this in between almost of the I Hate 5 Iron Frenzy group and the 90s recovery group, but with some other odd topics that continue to come up. And then there's the I Hate 5 Iron Frenzy group, which is off the rails. So it's like this spectrum of groups you can be involved in on Facebook that I do. I appreciate all three of them for different reasons, because they all kind of have their own flair, and I occasionally turn one of them off because I've had enough for a time. And it's not the one you would think it was. You'd think I would be all in on the I Hate 5 Iron Frenzy group, but that's the one that I occasionally just need a break from. So
there's all kinds of flavors out there, and there are a few where you can almost entirely avoid politics, which is a blessing in a season like this.
Yeah, I actually think both the Pickle and Boot Shop, it's come up on the show, but I think they've realized it's not super productive.
It's not compelling conversation.
Yeah. And so I think they both have kind of realized that they're not going to go there as often, maybe. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it happens a ton on the discussion. Now there's been moments. And then I feel like that 90s recovery group really avoids it well. It doesn't seem to be it just doesn't seem to come up as much. And so that I appreciate that group for that, because I can get my politics in plenty of other places on Facebook.
A good moderator really does the Lord's work, I think. And that really, I think, is what's happening there.
Yeah. I like the spam Sundays too, that I can throw out my podcast with totally guilt-free. Like,
that's right. Promote your stuff. Listen. That's what this is for.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and maybe it's worth saying too, just the fact that, Joe Yerke and Reese Roper, very different in how they see the world, what their political perspectives and maybe even religious perspectives are. And the fact that they remain friends and keep on making a show together, even after having had several arguments on mic that you can go back and listen to.
Yeah.
It's what gives me faith in humanity above anything else, is that these two guys can stay friends and keep talking.
Yeah.
And that's really a blessing, I think.
Yeah, it's there. Yeah, I'm probably too close emotionally to be able to comment on it, but yeah, it's been a couple moments where I've had to turn the show off for a little bit, because I'm just like, I love you both so much, and I don't want to listen to you. I don't want to hear mom and dad fight.
Tense. Yep.
So awesome. Well, Brock, thanks so much for joining me. We did hit the hour mark. My bad hosting. I'm just all over the place. I really, really appreciate coming on the show anytime. I think you're one of my go-to guests because of the way you answered some of these questions, specifically that why it's important to you. That's what I'm going for on this show. I'm not gonna get into music theory and some of those deep things that are on the musical side, but for me, the love of music is why it means something to you and why it can feel important, and that's such an eloquent answer. And that's what I'm going for on the show. So thanks for coming back for a third time. I think this is third time.
Sounds right. Yeah.
Sounds right.
It's kind of you.
Hopefully it's not the last. Hopefully you aren't done with me.
I look forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Thanks again for listening to this episode of the Album Anniversary Podcast. I want to thank again Brock for joining the show. Third time being on the show to talk about Curse Your Branches by David Bazan. It's always great to have him on the show. It's always great to talk to him. And just what a great explanation of why this album is important to him. And that's what we're going for on the show. I may have said it before, but that's what we're going for. We want to know why these albums are important and why we love these albums. We want to hear people explain that. So that's what we're going for on the show. So Brock, thanks again for joining. I love having you on the show, and the explanation of why this is important, just so beautiful and so eloquently done. Just thanks so much for coming on the show. Let us know what you thought about this episode. What do we get right and what do we get wrong about this album? What are your favorites from this album? You can find me on Twitter at Caleb the Spy. There's no spaces in that. I'm also on Instagram with underscores in between the words. And you can always email me at the show or end the show, whatever. Caleb the Spy podcast, that's with an S at the end, at gmail.com. No spaces or underscores in that. If there are albums that should be on my calendar, please let me know. If they're worth celebrating, I'll try and get them added to the calendar. Well, I think I've started to say this every episode. I'm way behind. I'm trying to catch up on some things. If you want to join the show, the easiest way to do that is to follow me on Twitter. I did that for this. I threw out this album. This was an album I was interested in doing a show on, and Brock responded and said, hey, I'd be interested in talking about that album, and that's why I had him back on for a third time. So that's how I kind of try and find guests. If I don't have somebody in mind, is I'll throw it out on Twitter, ask the question, and see if somebody wants to join me. Please subscribe and share the podcast if you're so inclined. Leave a rating or review. I have heard it is an effective way to spread the word about podcasts. Most of all, I do want to say thanks if you engage with me at all on social media. I put a lot of time and energy into setting up the daily posts. Seeing people get excited to revisit or discover older albums is always a thrill. This week's been super busy in particular. Lots of responses, lots of engaging conversation. I love it. So thanks so much if you engage with me at all on social media. If you enjoy this show, you might also enjoy the other show I do with my friend Scott that we referenced earlier. It's called I Survived Youth Group in the 90s, and it's not just a podcast where we reminisce about our youth and our youth group experience. We're trying to go out and interview fellow 90s youth group kids and some from the 2000s and kind of find out where they're at now and how that youth group experience has impacted their lives. Whether they're at the same church they were raised at or they left the faith entirely, we just want to have that conversation to hear about their experiences. So again, that's I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. The music at the beginning and the end of this show is the instrumental version of the song Sing It Out at Street Level by Peg and the Rejected. Thanks so much for joining me, and we will talk to you soon. If I don't know that release date, I might just put a date on my calendar as a chance to celebrate that album. And that's what I do. This is bad. 3, 2, 1. I don't know if I say his name right. Oh, well.
You do. Curse Your Branches is the title. Just
Curse Your Branches.
If you want to take a run again.
What did I say the first time?
Curse the Branches.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'll just make fun of myself in a second.
There we go. Easy enough.
Yeah.